Welcome back to episode 85 of Into the Arena. I'm Holly,
I'm Emily.
and we have an amazing friend here who I will introduce in just a moment. But before we dive in, just make sure to turn on our notifications. We've been doing a few giveaways, we've been doing some live events, we've been having random news come out at random times. So make sure you have your notifications turned on so you can keep up to date on all things Hunger Games. Let's dive right into today's episode. I'm really happy to introduce or reintroduce our great friend, Dr. Thomas Paradis, and I would argue like psychic potentially. We'll talk about it because going back to our episode, you predicted so much of Sunrise, but if you've seen episode 56, which is an episode about his class that he teaches at Butler University, unpacking the Hunger Games, we also talked about his book on the Hunger Games, A Place Called District 12, which is really exciting. I have that copy here. And then we're gathering here today to talk about Behind the Ballads, which is your new book all about the people, places, and music of the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. So we're so excited to have you back. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me back. This is a pleasure and an honor, actually. So,
No, the honor is ours. We're so excited to talk to you again.
So I feel like we should probably address really first, I didn't put this in our notes or anything, but both of us were preparing for this episode and you kind of predicted Sunrise. Like you indicated that there was going to be another book. And when I was listening to it, you said that it was interesting how we left out this gap from District 12 within the gap of around Katniss's parents' time, which we found out is going to be Sunrise on the Reaping. So you're a pretty good friend to have because what's coming next for the Hunger Games?
50-50 shot, right?
No, but you got it. So it was so cool to go back and watch that episode. If you haven't watched or listened to that episode, Dr. Paradis is so full of amazing knowledge all on everything the Hunger Games. Like your books are so fascinating. So I just thought that was really cool that here we are getting ready for another book and you kind of like predicted it.
Well, I really appreciate that. I'd have to go back and look at that myself because I didn't realize I was that close, but that's good.
Yeah, I guess we'll just dive right in because we have a lot to unpack today. We have your book, we have Sunrise, we have Ballad, we have your class. What compelled you to explore the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes on a deeper level? And how did geography and music specifically shape your interest and direction in studying the Hunger Games for those who maybe missed the last episode?
Absolutely. First of all, my interest kind of dovetailed into my earlier book, like you mentioned, when I had actually read the Ballad novel for the first time and found so much in there that I could relate to with my own academic interests and the things I teach, architecture, environmental geography, urban studies, music, of course, it's all in there. So as a cultural geographer, I was just fascinated with the whole thing. Then, of course, Ballad came out, and we were all stoked for that for a long time. Once the film came out, I knew I had a lot to work with and a lot to hopefully teach. I'm kind of an educator at heart. That's, put me in front of a classroom. If I can share something that other people can learn from and at least consider, different perspectives and so forth, I'm there. I really thought that in some ways Ballad, including the novel and the film, both kind of got some short shrift in some ways because I think there's so many layers of meaning, so many aspects about Suzanne Collins' interpretations of her own characters and what she had in mind with the messaging of the story and what shows up in Ballad, the film, and maybe does not show up in Ballad so much. I thought there was a good space to work on a guide of some kind. My other book, I think, was admittedly pretty wordy, kind of more academic. It's kind of designed for libraries and for uses by, students and classes and things like that. This one is more of a guide. So kind of get down to the basics and say, all right, what does Tom Blythe's character really mean? What are they trying to do? What is Suzanne trying to point out about his character? What are the filming locations all about? And why is that significant? And a lot of people may not realize a lot of that background about what the producers actually decided, and why. I thought I'd have some fun, do some more research. I learned a lot about the movie industry, development of films like this, the production, the screenwriting. Fun for me to dive into it and hopefully share some of that with our fellow fans.
Yeah, I feel like that's what jumped out at us about your book originally when we first found it was that it included Ballad, because there had been so many guides and books before that were just focused on the trilogy. But when we saw that you were talking about Ballad, like that really excited us. And I love the shift in this book too, that it's more focused on being that guide. This is a big question, but our last episode was almost 2 years ago. It was almost a year before the movie came out, and now it's been a year since it came out. What are your thoughts on the film? What did you think?
The discussion around the film, of course, has been a lot of fun and wonderful. And, my opinions aren't any better, than anybody else's out there. So, but I do have some thoughts based on the research that I've conducted. I think I've found a greater appreciation for what the producers pulled off in the film. Certain things, of course, were changed. But one thing I really did like about the film, among several, was that it does stay fairly true to the book. And that's similar to the previous films as well. I think the producers did a genuine job. They made a genuine effort in looking at the stories and what Suzanne Collins had in mind. And, based on all the interviews I've seen of Francis Lawrence, the director, he was out there a lot before and after Ballad was released, kind of explaining a lot of what they were doing. And he's genuinely interested, as were his fellow producers, in making sure that Suzanne Collins' stories came to light, and that for as much as possible in a 2+ hour film you could do. Have her intentions for writing the series in the first place, writing the Ballad novel. So I was very impressed with that. And beyond that, I felt there was space for a guide like I put together, because there's so much more beneath the surface. Other aspects that I researched more, I learned to love over time. So for instance, I wasn't that thrilled originally with the filming locations. We can talk more about that. But once I understood more of the purpose, that they were really trying to go for a period piece, kind of post-war reconstruction of East Berlin and going into Poland for a few of those shots as well, I became more impressed with that. And it was a genuine attempt again to locate the film in actual meaningful places rather than just filming these things on a studio set. So I learned to appreciate that. There are other aspects that they really went out of their way, I think, to produce a seriously quality production. Rachel Zegler, they pulled her in. She's singing live on set, which I don't know how many people realize that. Maybe a lot of fans know that now, but that's very rarely done in the development of films nowadays. Usually you do the pre-records, they lip sync or quietly lip it or something when they're singing on stage, but otherwise that was a big difference. I was impressed with the casting, others bringing the stars in, Peter Dinklage and Jason Schwartzman and Viola Davis. It was very clear that they also, Francis Lawrence mentioned this too, very intentionally, that the producers wanted to bring in new faces, new people into the industry that may not have had an opportunity to be a part of this kind of franchise film. And quite honestly, Tom Blythe is one of those. He had to audition like a lot of other people. So there's those aspects, and there are other things I enjoyed.
How would you rank it in comparison to the other films for you?
For me personally, I enjoyed all the films. Actually, still to this day, one of my favorite of the original series was The Hunger Games, so the first film. Catching Fire was a close second. I did really enjoy Ballads as well. It's right up there. It's just kind of, I've enjoyed all of them. It's very close to being a favorite. I don't know if it is my favorite. A few things I can't get past, but otherwise, it's close.
It's hard to rank something that you love so much, because you don't want to put anything last, because you're like, oh, but it's not really last. I love it still.
Mm-hmm.
It's also hard because Ballad, as we all know, had such a different task than the other books did. Besides Mockingjay, there's so much that goes into Ballad, and I'm really happy that we have a book like your new book, because we didn't get a companion book to come out with Ballad to explain these things. And what I really enjoy about the production of this film is that they did take into consideration historical connections and real life pieces of information that can connect this series to our real world, which I think they did a great job, like you said, at accomplishing that. But again, there was just a whole nother beast when you're looking at however long of a book Ballad is compared to The Hunger Games, Catching Fire, that sort of thing.
Right.
So what is your thought on splitting The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes not into 2 parts? It was like a long film, but what was your thoughts on the timing And like, I'm really interested to hear what you thought about them breaking it up, like physically breaking it up into part one, part two, and part three in the movie.
First of all, there's a little background and history to this.
Hmm.
Second of all, there's kind of my thought, my opinion on it. I really don't think this film lent itself to two parts. I would have been skeptical as much as I loved part three of the novel. I think there would have been some issues finding a 2 hour long storyline to provide for the last half or last third of Ballad. I'm sure they could have done it, and I would have liked it. More of the
Hmm.
Cubby, more of District 12. Sure, I'd take another film. Would it have been realistic? Maybe not. It seemed more with Mockingjay, in my opinion, and other things I've seen, that it made more sense to break that one up. If a film was going to be broken up, it would have been that one, for Mockingjay. There was kind of a distinct beginning and ending parts, kind of halfway through with PETA and all of that. This one didn't seem to lend itself to that. So I would have appreciated a longer film. It's not a new thing to have 3 hour feature films. Even some of the great Academy Award winners have been 3 hours,
Hmm.
kind of touching that limit. So would it have been a real problem to leave some of the editing and give us 20 more minutes? I think that would have really been more satisfying to fill in some of the scenes, fill in some of the music and so forth. But that said, there is some history to this. Francis Lawrence has done interviews, and others have as well, about there was a lot of blowback for splitting up Mockingjay. And I had not realized that until I discovered it. So Francis Lawrence and the producers seem to have been spooked, that's my word, from splitting up Mockingjay, because Francis Lawrence, when asked about it, he said absolutely no way. He would not split. He would not have done it. He regrets to this day that they split up Mockingjay. He thought it was a good idea originally, and he kind of turned around on that and said he regrets it. So when he was asked about splitting the film for this one, he's like, no way. We're not going to try that again. We're going to create a full, satisfying film and do it once. I think the Mockingjay experience and all the criticism they got was, making people wait for a full year for Mockingjay Part 2. Again, I didn't have a problem with that. I thought it was kind of fun.
Yeah, I
You
feel
know,
like most of the blowback on that was pre the movies coming out. Because I remember some of that in the fandom. We were confused why there was going to be two movies. Does it really need to be two movies? They're just copying Harry Potter and, other franchises that have done that in the past. But I feel like the fandom loved it after the fact. Like, we're all so happy that it's two movies now. But maybe after the box office wasn't as high for Mockingjay Part 2, then it was more of a studio thing. Regretted that decision. I don't know.
yeah, that's really interesting. There may be a link there. I mean, it seems almost like they were concerned about what happened with Mockingjay and they didn't want to make the same mistakes, and they might have overcorrected, keep it down at 2 hours and 37 minutes with the credits or whatever it was.
Yeah, you would think because they didn't want to do the two films that they would absolutely make it the length that it needs to be.
But that's us, right?
Yeah, super fans.
Yeah, exactly.
An interesting conversation that people can dive into in your book, especially, is the idea of Ballad, the movie, being a musical. And I thought that that part of your book was really fascinating because you dive into what makes a musical, and you go through and decide, is Ballad a musical? And so, because you discuss these tropes and descriptors of what makes a musical, can you talk us through like what your answer is? Is it a musical or is it not?
Yeah, so that was an interesting question that actually came up long before the film came out, when the novel was out, and we were actually, I assigned it to my class, and I actually brought that up at one point, almost kind of in jest, and thought about even the Hunger Games overall as being a musical, and the students didn't want any part of that. It's kind of interesting that the story Suzanne gives us in Ballad lends itself to that. I thought, well, I wanted to do a little more research on Broadway. I really, love that genre. And I thought, what kind of aspects of musicals basically would help define ballad in one way or another? The types of tropes, basically the approaches or stories that you find in a typical Broadway musical. And, maybe more so in the past, but still today to some extent. And there are about 14 or 15 separate characteristics that you might find in a typical musical, and not all musicals have all 15. One author provided these 15 things, which I thought was very useful as a comparison. So I thought, okay, how many of these does Ballad actually have? And I only found three. For instance, It's got a love ballad. So that's one thing you find in musicals. Lucy Gray's Pure as the Driven Snow. That could be interpreted as a love ballad. It's as close to the strong relationship, the romantic relationship that Lucy Gray had with Coriolanus at the time. One reason I think people saw this as a musical to some extent is because of the reprises. So often songs are reprised, and they certainly are in the novel. And not all of that is carried over to the film. For instance, The Hanging Tree is reprised a couple of times within the novel. I think it's done once in the film. Some of the other songs are not reprised just because there's not enough time in the film to do that. There's a showstopper, for instance. That's another thing you find in musicals. It's been interpreted that Nothing You Can Take From Me would classify as a showstopper. With Lucy Gray and the Covey up on stage doing their thing.
Yes.
But beyond that, there is really no other reason we could classify this as a musical. And so I had to decide for myself that it's like, no, it's not. It doesn't meet that characteristic. The other thing is Francis Lawrence did come out and pretty much say, yeah, it's not a musical. He actually was concerned. I think the producers were concerned about going down that road too much. So they actually tried to pull back on that. And it's kind of interesting, a concern they had with bringing Rachel in so soon after West Side Story, after pulling her in from that project. They were concerned she would bring in that quality of kind of Broadway singing, Broadway style to this one. And they were relieved, apparently, that she did not. She was able to switch gears pretty quickly and move into the character that Lucy Gray was meant to be. So they weren't trying to have her be Broadway. They were trying to have her be Lucy Gray and get away from that genre. The story itself, so the way Suzanne Collins characterizes Lucy Gray, it's not designed as a musical. So Lucy Gray is a performer. As she says in the film, one of the famous quotes is, I only sing when I have something to say. I don't sing, when I'm told. So it's about her story. So her songs tell her story more thoroughly. It's part of her character development. And so basically you have a story about a performer. So it kind of makes sense that she's going to perform in the story. But that's not the rationale for the actual story or film in the first place.
I love that. I think just reading that whole part, it's just so funny in a sense to me to think of such dark material like Ballad being like a upbeat, because when I think of a musical, I think of like upbeat, musical. And so it's just interesting to hear all of these different traits and qualifications that make things a musical. But I just love that discourse that you have in your book. So I definitely think if you haven't read the book, you definitely need to read it because of that, because I think it's just such an interesting conversation that we can continue having, even though it's clearly not a musical. Music does take an important form in the book and the movie. And I think off of that, what I really like is in your music section of the book, you mentioned that Rachel Zegler refers to music being an additional character in the film. And so I just kind of wanted to talk about how does the music in Ballad influence the story in a way that a character would? Because we're seeing so much power behind music, but it's not technically a musical.
It was insightful when I saw that quote from Rachel about thinking of this as a separate character in the songs themselves. And I think that related to something she was reacting to about Dave Cobb, who produced the music, out of Nashville. He had a big role in this. And so I think it was partly the production of the music for the film, as well as the actual lyrics that accompanied the songs that Suzanne had in mind in the first place. So kind of a combination of those things. Yeah, she actually felt that there was a separate character kind of behind Lucy Gray, kind of supporting Lucy Gray. I think it goes back to this idea that the songs that Suzanne had in mind for this are designed to provide the backstory to Lucy Gray's life. As short as it is so far, she's got a lot to say. And a lot of that shows up in her own ballads, the Ballad of Lucy Gray. And of course, the Wordsworth poem that was turned into kind of the background parallel to her story. So that's all part of it. Lucy Gray's story is embedded into the songs. One of the things I might have improved personally on the film is to have the songs be more distinct with the lyrics. I think some of the songs got lost. Not only were they not included, which I understand that. They didn't include about 3 of the songs from the novel. They did include a lot, so I was pleased with what they did. But I think the songs get shortchanged, they get cut off. Billy Tope comes in at in my opinion, the wrong moments, cuts off her music, from the first concert. I'm like, why is he coming in so soon? Anyway, I think a lot of the lyrics got lost in the shuffle. I think it's just hard to understand. I think I saw the film 4 times in the theater at various times. And I was thinking to myself, if I didn't know the lyrics in advance, would I be able to understand what was being sung? And
yeah.
sometimes I didn't think that was the case. That was another reason I thought, I think maybe fans would appreciate a guide to go back to the songs and say, okay, what was the real meaning? What were the real lyrics? What were they trying to do? Considering the songs as a separate character, kind of got lost in the film a little bit. My favorite song, I will say, whether or not it was represented well in Ballad, was the Ballad of Lucy Gray, telling her kind of past story with Billy Tope and all of that. I thought that was a very emotional, kind of heart-wrenching kind of song. And I thought the way Dave Cobb and the producers and the musicians, everybody put that together so well. But then in the film, they have Coriolanus watching it on television, so it's kind of like secondhand music, and you can't hear the full effect of the song when he's watching from the hospital bed, if I'm recalling correctly. I think they lost an opportunity there with that one, but still, if you look at the storyline, that is pretty genuine to the story itself. We're not there to watch the performance of Lucy Gray. We're there to watch Coriolanus's reaction. Depends what perspective you want to look at.
You mentioned that you did a lot of research on the filming locations, and I love that section of the book. I think a lot of us were really surprised, like you mentioned, that they ended up filming in Europe and not going back to Appalachia for District 12. But could you talk about what some of your favorite filming locations are now that you've done all of that research?
This is one of the things that grew on me as I was looking into it. I remember originally when the film was being produced, I saw some fan sites out there with images of the filming locations, and sometimes they'd find some of the scenes being filmed. I was suspicious at first because of my own interest in having them stay local. So originally I was concerned that when I found out they were going to Europe, I'm like, what are they doing? What are they thinking? I really took a deeper dive into the filming locations, and I was just amazed. They were very intentional with these places. These were not just random places they found in Berlin because they cost less. Every place that they filmed had a historical meaning to it that has a parallel with Suzanne's story. And it was a different direction than I had envisioned for this, but it's one that made a lot of sense. I mean, basically, the producers envisioned a period piece, and I actually set my book around that. My guide basically is based on the premise that you're looking at a period piece here. It may not be what a lot of people had thought would happen with Ballad, but when you're looking at the messaging that underlies Suzanne's intent, looking at post-war reconstruction, looking at what was the capital like probably, in the 10 or 15 years after the revolution, her messages about war and war recovery are important. And that's one of the reasons, of course, a lot of us appreciate the series, not just for the fun around it, but the historical parallels. So the fact that they turned this into a period piece, I was really impressed with. So that got my geography and architectural interest going. And I started realizing, kind of the architectural history of some of these places is fascinating. So for instance, I really thought it was a great idea to do a lot of the filming at Olympic Park, Berlin, the site of the 1936 Olympic Games. Hitler was there. It was designed. Actually, the games there were the first ever to be televised for the Olympics. So there's a parallel there.
That's my personal favorite
Nice.
filming connection of how they put that together. So cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was early technology too, just like we see, in both the novel and the film. It was this early technology that we see, the games were ramping up in a sense for the Olympics. And they were trying, of course, the darker side was that Hitler and the Nazis were trying to promote the Aryan race. That didn't go so well when Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. But that's the history, that they built in to the filming production. And so the fact that they used several sites at Olympic Park, they used that for the outside of the arena, not the inside. Right next door to that, to the Olympic Stadium, they used the fencing arena. So the fencing arena becomes the headquarters for the 10th games, which all the mentors go in to watch. So I think a lot of that that was done at Olympic Park made a lot of sense. Centennial Hall, that was another big location that has kind of the darker history associated with the Nazi regime. Centennial Hall was up in Poland. So one of the reasons they went up to Poland, I discovered, was to find Centennial Hall. Yeah, Wrocław, the city of Wrocław, where the arena was filmed, of course, for Ballad. But that was also where Hitler did some of his rallies to promote the Nazi cause before the war. And so there's kind of that ghostly heritage to the place. And so it kind of made sense to do some filming of the arena there, kind of with some parallel messaging. And there were a lot of others, as I wrote about. The classroom space, for instance, that has a neat little history as a veterinary classroom from the late 1700s, one of the first veterinary colleges in Europe. That's where they filmed the classroom. So those are some of the places. I do want to mention, actually, you asked about one of my favorites. I really liked their use of Strasburger plots, kind of butchering the German here, but Strasburger plots was used for the city circle and the massive statue that was in the center there. And they used a lot of CGI for that. But beyond that, it's an actual place. And the main boulevard that comes into Strasburger Platz, the city circle there, is Karl Marx Alley. And that whole kind of complex of the city was part of East Berlin. And that part was being redeveloped, kind of rebuilt after the war during the 1950s, 1960s. So again, it kind of paralleled that time when the capital was being rebuilt. And it was actually happening there. So it was under the communist, kind of authoritarian government of, being run essentially by the Soviets. And so they used Soviet-style architecture for the apartment blocks, for the communist-style housing and all of that you see in the film. And so a lot of that was really meaningful with respect to the architecture and the boulevard and the city circle. It's all right there. So that was fun.
I guess we can transition over from Ballad talk to Sunrise talk.
Yes.
What were your initial thoughts when you heard Sunrise was being announced? Were you excited for a new book? And when you found out it was from Haymitch's perspective, what was your initial reaction to that excerpt and following him?
I think my emotions were two things at the same time. It was shock and it was excitement. The Haymitch perspective, I think, is wonderful. I'm looking forward to it. I am actually still kind of surprised that Suzanne is going to focus on the games. It seems like it's going in that direction. Even when they first announced the book, when there was all this speculation, the fandom was speculating about all the different directions the book could go in, I would have been surprised to actually see a focus on his games. But again, as kind of like Lucy Gray, right? Suzanne Collins only writes something when she has something to say. She doesn't write when she's told. She writes when she has something to say. And she definitely has certain messaging behind this, the story. And it's going to be interesting to see how her take on propaganda, it seems that's going to be one of the main kind of underlying themes that she has about this. Why do people feel compelled to follow certain leaders, in the way they do and the way we do? So that's going to be an underlying theme. And I guess that's going to play out with Haymitch in the games. So I think it'll be fun. I think the fans are looking forward to it. Suzanne Collins always has a message. She has a purpose. And I guess she felt like she wanted to get this out there sooner rather than later.
Do you think we're going to see another period piece with Sunrise on the Reaping? Because we know it takes place before Katniss's time, but after Ballad, so in between.
That's a great question. So I don't think so. In terms of a period piece focusing on, kind of a specific historical period and place and time, I don't think so. I think we would be going back to District 12 more, but also if she takes a similar approach with this book as the original Hunger Games, which it seems like there's some parallels setting up. It starts kind of early on with the reaping. I imagine we're going to have the actual games themselves, and then follow up after that to some extent. So we may get to see more of the capital. It kind of makes sense. We're going to see, or at least learn about something that was happening in the capital. We might see an early Plutarch. I don't know. I know there was a lot of talk about the idea of having Plutarch be a central figure.
We're clowns. We know.
We wanted it so bad.
Right. And that was a great idea. Yeah, it's kind of interesting to me that she's going kind of almost back home to Haymitch and the games. I was actually kind of surprised about that, the way it's been
Yeah.
developing.
Us too.
It's, yeah, I mean, I think it'll be great, but it's interesting. She's kind of going home to that. So as a period piece, I don't see that happening. I think there's more opportunity to look at, the capital kind of to the extent kind of superficially, like we did in the original Hunger Games. You see some of the capital, but it's not really a central part of the story in this one. And so it's going to be more in the games. It's going to be more in District 12. This is my foggy crystal ball, I think, but it kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it feels like it's almost going to be the reverse of what we got with Ballad.
Yeah, I don't foresee there's going to be a lot of music. I think if I were to guess, there's not a lot of reason to have this be a real music heavy film. I should say book first. I don't see music being a big part of this either. Aside from, I would love to see kind of the development of maybe more the Hanging Tree song, and some of the ballads, my guess, are going to show up, because if I were to hope and guess, this is wishful thinking, I would bet that we're going to see more of the backstories of Katniss's parents, and where District 12 was at that time with respect to songs that were banned, like the Hanging Tree, because Katniss's mother has a cow, as we remember back in Mockingjay, when she starts singing the Hanging Tree, and with her father and so forth. So I don't think there's going to be a lot of music in this one, but I think there's going to be enough to kind of carry over from the Covey, kind of from the Ballad novel. You don't have a performer in this one that we know of, so it's not going to go in the direction that Ballad went. I think Ballad was kind of a one-off, kind of once and done sort of thing, because we were focusing on Lucy Gray as a character. I'm curious to see if we actually learn more about the Mockingjay pin, because that is a story I'd like to see developed more, about the kind of history of the Mockingjay pin and how it ends up with Maisley Donner, and kind of in that generation, eventually getting handed down to Katniss. My students actually do a project on this. It's kind of a classroom project. It's kind of off the cuff for about 20 minutes, but actually looking at a family tree, as I call it, of the Mockingjay pin, and looking at kind of how that pin migrated from Maisley Donner, through the mayor's family, through Madge, and then to Katniss, and briefly to Prim, for instance. So I'm curious to see more about that side of the story in District 12, kind of the heritage of the Mockingjay pin, Katniss's parents. I think there's a lot of opportunity to tell a lot of that story, and kind of the relationships, maybe even Peeta's father and how he comes into the mix, and how he gets to know Katniss's mother. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm hoping that Susanna is going to build a lot of that in. So I guess I would end there with my hope of what we're going to see.
And it's so interesting because it will come out March 18th, which will be in the middle of your semester. So
Yes.
how do you plan to integrate a new story into your class? Kind of just like halfway through. That's like midterm season.
That's going to be fun.
Actually, the funny thing is, I think it would only took me 2 or 3 seconds once I learned another book was coming out. I immediately thought, okay, we're going to do this in my class. And then my next thought was, oh no, I have to take out yet another assignment that I've already developed for that class, because now I have to integrate another book. So I shifted around my spring semester a couple of years ago so we could integrate Ballads, which has been wonderful. But it does take 5 weeks. We take 5 weeks to do a deep level read of Ballad, and that takes time, obviously. So I don't think my students are upset. They're doing one less essay and one less something else, but they're still doing a lot of the interpretation and analysis around it. So anyway, yeah, I'm looking forward to having the Sunrise book be part of my class, and I thought it's great timing. My students are stoked for it, so we've been promoting it since the beginning of the semester. I teach 2 semesters of a first-year seminar class, and at Butler University, it's required. So everybody takes a themed first-year seminar, and the faculty member can decide on the theme, once it's approved, to teach on. And so there are all sorts of wonderful topics for first-year seminar, and this is the one I've developed over the last 5 or 6 years now. And so I have spring semester with the same students. So we look at the series in the fall. So the original series And then part of the first half of spring semester, like in January, February, we focus on Ballad. And then now I will find a way to incorporate after spring break, it's perfect timing, to focus on the new book. So we're all going to read it together because obviously I can't really come up with assignments on it too easily because I haven't read it yet. So we're all going to do that together, maybe take 2 or 3 weeks to do it, something like that, and see what people think of it. So that'll be fun to integrate into the second semester.
Do you plan to sit down and get the book immediately and read it all, or are you gonna like sit through and like read periodically, like with your class? I'm
Oh,
curious how you're gonna dive into this.
I don't think I can wait that long, so
Yeah.
I will probably dive right into it. I do want to make sure there's enough time for the students to acquire the book. So, but they'll know about it. They know they can pre-order it and that sort of thing.
We don't know how we're reading it either. So we don't know.
Everyone's freaking out.
Yes, it will shape up as time comes, and we'll see how much I can get ahead of the students. But otherwise, it might be fun just to read it with them.
You sent us some of those projects or assignments that your class was working on to see. And I think it's so cool that you're working on a project or you just completed a project that's going to connect to Sunrise. Like you're going to get the answers of this family tree of the Mockingjay pin. So I think that's just so exciting. It's going to come full circle. We'll get our answers. And I guess my last question for you is there another book from you coming? We have another book coming from Suzanne. So does this mean we're getting a
gotta
third book on
complete the
Sunrise?
trilogy.
Right. So that's a great question. I do not know the answer to that yet. I have to get inspired by something, maybe like Suzanne. So I appreciate the fact that she's giving us so much to discuss and write about. I was intrigued with Ballad, especially because of the musical component, because of the District 12 component, and a lot of things like that. So we'll see if I get it so inspired for this next one.
A second edition of your
Well,
first
there you
book.
go. We could do that. You know, I'm certainly not ruling it out because I've gotten involved with projects I never thought I would get involved with.
Well, if you haven't already checked it out, you should check out Dr. Paradis's book, Behind the Ballads. It's on Amazon. We'll link it down below. Check out Dr. Paradis. He is so interesting, knows so much. Books are so fascinating, and it's always great to have such a wonderful conversation with you. So thank you so much for taking the time to come back to our show, conclude this conversation on Ballad a couple years later. And we look forward to potentially having more conversations with you in the future. So thank you so much.
And I'll look forward to keep listening too. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
See you next time. Bye.
See ya.